Hello, welcome to your last social influence lesson. So today we're finishing off what we started last lesson, and we're going to do the social influence processes in social change evaluation. Think back to last lesson and tell me, what are the 5 steps of conversion and how did the suffragettes show these 5 steps? So number 1 was drawing attention to the issue. The suffragettes did this by using educational, political and militant tactics to draw attention to the inequality of women. Then there is a cognitive conflict, and this is where the majority hold a position or a view that is different to that of the minority. And in this case, in the suffragettes example, it was the right to vote. So the majority and the existing status quo was that only men could vote, and this created a conflict between their viewpoint of they wanted women to be able to vote too. Consistency of position. So they were always consistent with their views. The suffragettes started in 1903. They only got the right to vote in 1918. So it was a long process and a long time of fighting for this change. The augmentation principle, when you are willing to suffer or sacrifice something. So loads of women were imprisoned, they went on hunger strikes. Emily Davison even died for the cause. So this is how they showed the augmentation principle. And the last step is the snowball effect. And this is when at first it's a relatively small effect, and then it just spreads more widely. And this was shown because eventually there was a universal suffrage, so everybody was allowed to vote. So we're going to look at some evaluation issues, and with social change, they're slightly different to the ones we've looked at in previous topics because they don't all quite fit the point evidence explanation format. Some of them are more, in fact all of them, are more of a discussion. And the ones we're going to look at is social change through minority influence is very gradual. So that's a weakness of this explanation. Being perceived as deviant limits the influence of the minority. Number 3, social norms approach doesn't always work. And social norms and the boomerang effect. And then we're going to look at a way of overcoming the deviant minority by looking at the Communist Manifesto. Throughout history, we've seen that minorities don't bring about social change very quickly. It is a very slow process. So even though we have these 5 steps to conversion, it tends to take a really long time for any change to actually come about. This is because the majority hold the position, so they're more likely to maintain the status quo rather than engage in social influence. The influence of the minority, therefore, is more latent than direct, which means that the minority creates a potential for change rather than actual social change. Another problem is that minorities are perceived as deviant, and because of this, the majority don't want to align themselves to their views because they don't want to be seen as deviant themselves. And this is problematic because they focus more on the source of the message. So they focus more on these people who are protesting, getting arrested, being criminalised for trying to change something, rather than the message themselves. So the message kind of gets lost in this deviant behaviour. So in trying to bring about social change, minorities face a lot of hurdles. Because not only do they have to avoid being seen as deviant, which is difficult to do because you can't really push your opinion on someone without doing these things that the suffragettes did or that the civil rights movement did, like protest, for example. They have to make people embrace their position. And now we've got an evaluation issue about social norms intervention. So we saw last lesson that social norms intervention does actually have a lot of positive changes. So it's reduced drink driving, heavy driving, and teenage smoking. But these interventions have their limitations. So a study was done by De Jong, and he tested the effectiveness of marketing campaigns. And the marketing campaign wanted to reduce alcohol amongst teenagers, alcohol use. So they told them the perceived norm of teenagers drinking a lot was not the actual norm, but this didn't reduce the amount that teenagers drank. So not all social norms intervention are actually able to produce social change. So this weakens the explanation of social influence. Schultz et al. Describes something that we call the Boomerang Effect, and it's also to do with social norms intervention. So these social norms intervention are aimed at individuals whose behaviour is less desirable than the norm. So it's people who maybe drink and drive, or people who smoke too much or drink too much. Those whose behaviours is most desirable also receive the message though. So for those who already engage in constructive behaviour, so they drink less than the norm, they use less energy than the norm, the normative message can increase these aspects of their behaviour to be more in line with the norm. And this is called the Boomerang Effect. So social norms campaign might be effective in getting heavy energy users to use less electricity, but it can also lead those who use less energy to increase their usage. The last evaluation issue I want to talk to you about is a way to avoid being portrayed as deviant, and it's something that's been seen in history. The minority need to not be portrayed as deviant in order to persuade the majority to embrace their position. And this is what happened when with the birth of communism. So communism, for those of you who don't know, is a political ideology who want to establish a communist society, which means equal socioeconomic order. It means absence of social classes, money, state. And what they did to avoid being portrayed as deviant is they wrote this communist manifesto, and they stated in this communist manifesto that they had no interests separate from those of the majority. So the majority at that time were the proletariat, or the working class, and they emphasised that they were part of the proletariat and that the struggle was actually with the owners of the means of production. In other words, the bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie means the middle class, and that's actually where the word bougie comes from. So basically what they were saying is, we're not deviants, we're just like you. It's the bourgeoisie who are against us all. And this worked in helping them not be portrayed as deviants, so that the majority took on board their position. Your last task. I think you all know this story anyway, but I want to remind you of the story of Rosa Parks. So she was an African-American seamstress who broke the laws of segregation and refused to give up her seat at the front of a bus for a white man. At the time, only white passengers could sit at the front, whilst African-Americans had to find seats at the back, and she knew she was going to be arrested, and indeed she was. This was seen to be the start of civil rights movement in America. So I want you now to imagine that you are Rosa Parks and write an account according to social influence research that we've talked about. So the 5 steps of the conversion process of how this event contributed to social change. So consider, why was this event so influential, and which of the steps did this have? Okay, so it doesn't have to be really long, maybe even a paragraph. And as always, submit your notes onto Teams and let me know if there are any questions.